Here's a question to dwell on. Are thinkers more powerful in changing the course of history or politicians? That's the intersection where Jordan Peterson stands right now in his life, because the answer to this question determines whether Canada will ever get to see a Prime Minister Jordan Peterson. There's a lot of food for thought in this next clip, so let's get into it.
Jordan, why don't you go in there and see if you can be the leader of a great country like Canada and do something about it? Has that conversation ever taken place at this phase of your life?
Yes.
And?
Well, I've thought about a political career at different points throughout my whole life, literally starting when I was 14. In fact, that's what I thought I would do when I was 14. I worked for a political party in Canada. It was a socialist party, as it turns out. And I had that option open to me when I was very young. But I figured out when I was about 16 that I didn't really know anything. And so I had ideas, and I was capable of functioning in the realm of ideas and putting them forth, even then, I would say, in a somewhat compelling manner. But I figured out, partly because I had worked with a lot of small business people. These are all people who'd built businesses from the bottom up. They were all immigrants, because everybody in Northern Alberta was an immigrant. And they didn't share my left-wing presuppositions, but they were very admirable people. And part of what made them admirable to me wasn't their facility with ideological conceptions. So it wasn't an intellectual attraction. It was a practical attraction. I'd worked in restaurants in this little town I grew up in, Fairview. I talked to them one day about the Socialist Party in Canada, and Alberta at that time had a pretty good small business platform, probably better than the Conservatives had in terms of what it would do for small businesses. And I asked them one day, why aren't you in favor of this small business platform? Because they wouldn't vote for the NDP, the Socialist Party, to save their lives. They said, well, we don't want to be small business people. We want to be big business people. And so I learned then that
what a comment to make.
Well, the guy I worked with, his name was Scotty Kyle, and Scotty was a rough guy. He was about 35. I was about 15 at that time. And Scotty had been an alcoholic, and he had like all his teeth knocked out in fights. And like he was a rough guy, but he was super funny, and he was really smart. And he said to me one day, people don't vote their reality, they vote their dreams. And I thought, hey, man, that's a good phrase. You know, that stuck in my mind for the rest of my life. And so when I went to college, I went to take political science and literature, and I wanted to go into law school. I wrote the LSAT, and I was set to go to law school. I wanted to take corporate law. And the reason that I wanted to do that was to understand my enemy. That was the idea. But I realized about a year into my college education, for a variety of reasons, that partly reading George Orwell, but that wasn't all of it. But the party level activists, I never liked them from the beginning. I thought, I don't trust you guys. You just seem to be driven by resentment, not genuine care for the working class.
And in doing that, they probably lost a budding political mind in Peterson. You know why I say that? When you dig through Jordan's vast body of writing, you uncover his famous letter to his father at the age of just 25 that spells out exactly the political disillusionment he felt at the time. Among other things that serve a glimpse into a young Jordan Peterson, he wrote, quote, I looked for what I wanted to find where it was obvious to everyone it would be. In politics and political science, in the study of group behavior, this took up the years I spent involved with the NDP and in studying political science, until I learned that the application of a system of thought like socialism, or any other ism for that matter, to a problem and solving that problem were not the same thing. In the former case, you have someone who is not you to blame: the rich, the Americans, the white people, the government, the system. Whatever, as long as it is someone else. I think we can hypothesize why that is. Back in the 1970s and 80s, the world was still reeling from the genocides and wars of the Second World War, probably making a young and inquisitive Jordan Peterson extra wary of the right-wing Canadian populists at the time. But the other end of the spectrum gave him no political refuge. I remember Jordan once speaking about the one moment that disillusioned him from the left-wing parties of the time as a teenager. I was reading George Orwell's diagnosis of leftist parties, who Orwell said didn't love the poor, instead just hated the rich. So it's not compassion or justice driving it, but instead resentment and self-righteousness. Perhaps it was another one of such crossroads that Jordan Peterson stood at back then, and if parties of the left in Canada stayed true to their credentials of justice and equality, we might have seen Jordan rise through their ranks and become a very different character to who he is now.
In any case, I started to get interested in psychological motivations for political behavior, especially as I went through my political science degree, because there was an increasing emphasis as we moved away from the classics, which is what I studied in the first couple of years to more modern political thinking, let's say, it was all quasi-Marxist in that the political scientists believed intrinsically that people were only motivated by economic concerns. And I just never believed that. I thought, that's which economic concerns and why? Well, those questions weren't asked by political scientists. They took economic determinism as a starting point, and that never sat well with me. I thought there was a mystery there because it wasn't obvious to me what motivated people, and we're not ruled by our bellies as far as I'm concerned. So the idea of pure economic determinism was a non-starter, and that's really when I started to get interested in psychology. And I've made a choice all the way through my life. The choice has always been, say, political, sociological versus psychological, or perhaps spiritual, and I've always chosen the psychological work at the level of the individual. And I don't think I'm going to stop doing that. I mean, I have had discussions, serious discussions with people about a political career. And first of all, in my current situation, it isn't obvious to me at all that that wouldn't be less effective than what I'm already doing.
And that's what's at the heart of it. At the end of the day for Jordan, it's less about power and more about the legacy and impact that he can create in people's lives. It's actually an interesting debate from a historical perspective, because almost every powerful leader in history has a thinker, and that has influenced him the most, whether directly or indirectly. Nelson Mandela was influenced by South African humanist thinkers like Desmond Tutu. Margaret Thatcher's economic revivalism borrowed from Milton Friedman's ideas. And men like Lenin were a product of Karl Marx and socialist philosophers before him. Does Jordan Peterson fit more in the former camp or the latter? One way to answer that question is to see the massive impact that Jordan has had simply through his words and ideas in the last few decades. That's all we have to go by, and yet his insights have reverberated across the world in ways that hardly any politician can think of doing. It sounds paradoxical from the outside because politics is where the real power lies, but perhaps in the world today, words that can influence millions of people to take one tiny step in a direction create a much larger wave of change than anyone can fathom. The New York Times in 2018 agreed to calling Jordan Peterson, quote, the most influential public intellectual in the Western world, and considering the untapped hunger for intellectual engagement in young people, especially men. For the crisis of meaning that enveloped the new generation, Jordan sprung on the scene at just the right time and created an impact that few people could replicate. It's easy to argue how positive or negative that impact was, but from the point of view of sheer power, I think that we're realizing that the pen and microphone are more formidable tools in the 21st century to make a change than any seat of government could be.
Look, those are hard jobs, and and you get boxed in very quickly, and they're also brutal jobs, and it isn't obvious to me that I have the stomach for it. I don't really like fights. In fact, I don't like them at all. Part of the reason that I said what I said back in 2016 when I first stood up and voiced opposition to what the universities were doing and also what my government was doing was because I could see where that was going. I could see that it was going to generate conflict of all sorts. I knew, for example, that all this pronoun foolishness was going to confuse thousands, particularly of young women, because there's a very large clinical history of that sort of thing happening for 350 years. So that's detailed in a book called The History of the Unconscious, which is a great book by a man named Henry Ellenberger, who wrote the best book on the history of psychoanalytic thinking. And so I knew that. In any case, part of the reason I spoke up, we're going to have that fight right now. And we're going to make peace, because I don't want to have this fight every day for the rest of my life. And so it's going to be a pain to fight through it, because it's always a pain to fight through a conflict. But if you can fight through it, you can make peace, and then you don't have the conflict. And I really don't like conflict. So I don't like it deferred, because I know what happens if conflict is deferred. You get weaker because you backed off, and the conflict gets more intense because its tentacles grow, in a sense. It's like not paying a utility bill. It's like, for the first month, it's not that big a problem.
Despite that, I believe it's hard to rule out Jordan Peterson venturing into political waters. As rough as politics might be, it's always possible for a change of mind to catapult him into the political arena if there's genuine utility for him that he believes there is. One thing is for certain that politics on a larger picture has a lot to gain from a character like Peterson making his way in. That doesn't even have to be with direct participation, but can also happen with him being the influential mind that gives rise to a political avatar in his image. Maybe someone can rise up as an embodiment of the ideals and values that Jordan espouses and magnify Jordan Peterson's impact through the governmental seat of power. Until then, there's already millions of people that can testify to the impact of Jordan Peterson in their own personal lives.